This is Quorum with Quorum's Quorum. My guest today is Heather Stevenson, who's the General Counsel at Red Cell Partners. Heather's a fascinating combination of some seemingly opposing traits where she's been highly strategic with her career and yet open to wildly different roles. She has great ideas on being a better lawyer, but then she also has a strong focus on being a complete person. There's so many great ideas and stories packed into this episode. Here it is.
Heather, it's so great to finally sit down with you and have this conversation. I feel like this has been in the works for a while, so I'm glad that we're finally sitting down to do this.
Yes, me too. I always enjoy our conversations and fun to record one.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so you and I were talking, and I think just the most obvious place to start your story, I think one of the most interesting parts of your career as a lawyer or as a professional is the fact that you operate a popular juice bar in downtown Boston. So I think a lot of people are fascinated with that you left the practice of law to do that, and then also you returned to the practice of law. I think both are really interesting decisions to make. But so let's start with, how does a associate in New York at Sullivan Cromwell decide to open a juice bar in Boston?
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly a unique situation. So I was at Sullivan Cromwell for around 3 years as a litigator. I was doing mostly securities and shareholder derivative suits. And for the most part, I actually liked it. There are a lot of people who leave big law kind of like kicking and screaming about how horrible it's been, or, the sleepless nights that cause them to leave. For me, it was more a twofold situation of, one, looking ahead at the next 40, 50 years and not thinking that that was necessarily how I wanted to spend my life. Not because there was necessarily anything wrong with it. My colleagues were great. The work was interesting, but also the hours were long. And I wasn't finding it that rewarding. And then also being at a point in my life where trying other things really did feel like a possibility. I was recently married, but had no kids and really no financial responsibilities, beyond, taking care of myself and, my husband, who also worked. So we loved food. We loved Boston, had family here, and saw this kind of market gap for a juice bar. And we had thought about other things like, should I go to a smaller firm? Should I go to government? Should I try to clerk? But this felt like if I was ever going to start a food business, which was something that was really interesting to me, it was the time. There would be no better time. And so I knew the law would always be there, which I don't think people always feel is the case, but I felt confident I could go back one day if I needed to, and that I had this great opportunity to try something new that I thought Boston needed. And so I did it.
And then what was the calculus was there something with the economics of juice bars that seemed to, was economics in the business important to you, or just your personal passion? Of course, the intersection is important too, but did one factor dominate?
Well, we certainly thought that we would make a lot of money on the juice bar, but it wasn't like we thought we were, starting the next Facebook or anything. It seemed like an opportunity to do something that mattered, in terms of bringing healthy food to Boston, which is not necessarily known for having the healthiest food, although it has a lot of tasty food, in a way that would, create a lifestyle that we thought would be better and would also make, plenty of money. But it wasn't something that we started just for the money, or even with the intention of getting rich the way a lot of people do startups.
Was there a decision point at which you remember this crystallizing in your head, hey, because I think a lot of people have videos like this, it's such a cliche for a professional, I want to open a coffee shop or whatever, just something like that. What was it that made it crystallize for you? Oh no, this is actually something I can and I'm going to do now.
Yeah, so we joked about opening a food-based business. We joked about a restaurant for years before we actually did anything, and it was never serious. Neither of us is a trained chef. Opening a full restaurant is very expensive, very challenging, not something that we were well positioned to do. And then we were training for an ultra marathon, and eating a lot of acai bowl, drinking juices and smoothies in New York, and really loving it. And that's when we just noticed that there was this gap in Boston. We were living in New York at the time, but traveling home to Boston all the time as well. And so it was a gradual crystallization of, okay, maybe we could do a food-based business. Maybe it could be a juice bar. And I don't think we really felt totally sure we could do it until we played around with some numbers in one of those like business plan pre-populated spreadsheets that supposedly helps you plan your business. And as it turns out, all the numbers were completely wrong, both in terms of costs. Our costs were way, way higher than we predicted, but our revenue was far higher too. So that was good. But I think it was when we really started playing with numbers that we felt like maybe it was a possibility.
Well, on that note, I mean, like, let's say you're going to launch a juice business today. Like, what would you do differently?
Well, we saw this gap in Boston, and I now, having run a juice bar in Boston, understand the reason for that gap. And at least part of it is that the winters here are brutal and nobody wants a smoothie in the winter. I love smoothies. I don't even want a smoothie. All right. You want a smoothie in the winter. Yeah. I don't think I would actually do that much differently in terms of the startup. I think there were a lot of things we did right. There were things we did wrong along the way of actually operating it that probably could have made it more successful. But we also didn't end it just because it didn't do well financially. It did fine, but not well enough to be worth it. And, yeah, I mean, there were other reasons to leave. We've talked about some of these before, but, that it was a drain, a stressor. We had left Big Law to open this juice bar thinking it would maybe create a better lifestyle because eventually we'd have managers in place and we'd have all these stores and they would really run the day to day. And that was sort of true. But like when a pipe bursts, nobody cares about that more than the owner, right? Even if the manager is doing their best, you really need to be available. And so some of the reasons for ending it weren't so much a business failure as realizing I didn't want to be in the juice bar business.
Yeah. Okay. So it's just like so it sounds like really running things so far has been that you have done a good job of tuning into yourself to figure out, hey, like how do I want to allocate my attention and my professional development?
I think that's right. And I think what I've wanted has evolved over time a lot, which leads to the drastic changes that have happened over the course of my career, from Big Law to Juice Bar to in-house in a smaller company, at a media company, Boston Globe, and now to in venture capital, where it's a much heavier demand on my time. And I believe in seasons, right? Seasons of life. And so I think Thirst was really good for that season. And I feel really proud and happy that it really was one of the first to bring juice to Boston. There's a lot of juice bars in Boston now. That's great. Some of them do really well. Some of them are new every 2 years. And I think that's probably going to continue to be the case for a while. I feel happy about all that, but also, kind of glad that that part of my life is behind me.
Yeah. Wait, remind me again when you launched Thirst?
November of 2014, which was the start of the snowiest winter in Boston's recorded history. Every Monday, it felt like we had a blizzard and our trucks couldn't get through with the fruit because you need fresh fruit all the time, or our employees couldn't get to work because the subways shut down. It was a challenging first winter.
Well, it is so funny because my professional history is actually like weirdly tied to yours because in the time frame you launched, I had started going to Boston for a series of depositions pretty consistently as litigator, and I was in Chicago. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about Boston, in part because of you, is that there were more juice bars proportionally than Chicago, which is a much larger city. And so that was something that struck me to say, okay, Boston might be a more attractive place for me to be than Chicago. And so then I did end up, moving to Boston to join a firm there. So that's one bit of interesting coincidence. And the other bit of interesting coincidence, which I think we'll get into the significance of for you later, it comes from social media, which is I really love one of your smoothies you had. There was this like mango oat smoothie, which was like just a really unusual combination. Those are two food groups I would never think to put together. And actually, my wife would really love your juice bar the most. And so we were seeing each other long distance and we would always go there. And so that was kind of the smooth that I always get. And at one point on at Goodwin, we had a blog, Goodwin has a blog, and so I did contribute to it for biosimilars, and which is a kind of drug product. And so we had profiles of the different contributors. I was a very active contributor, really enjoying publishing there because I enjoyed the active publishing as a lawyer. And so at one point I was the featured editor, and so they have a little blurb about you, a little interview. And so I can't remember what the prompt was, but I decided to share this mango oat smoothie, which I pretended I'd come up with, but I didn't actually pretend I came up with it, but like I just said, I like to make now, which I was making. But I learned from thirst. And so then like I decided to get on LinkedIn and share that. Like my posts on LinkedIn were very vanilla, your classic big law. Here's a firm update. Here's a firm update, and that's it. Just never deviate out of the lines there. This was the first time I ever decided to have some flavor on LinkedIn. And then I actually had a lawyer that I used to work with who reached out to me about this. Said, "Oh yeah, I love that comment you made about that smoothie." So like it worked. So, like it got some of the attention that I knew. So in a couple of different ways, your juice bar has influenced me professionally.
I love that. I also love that smoothie. Our version, the thirst version, was called the Peruvian Pick-Me-Up. And I can't remember if you added this to yours, but it also had maca, which I was a huge fan of at the time. It was supposed to help with like energy regulation. And when I made the smoothie for myself, I would add almond butter. But yes, great smoothie.
Right. And I did the same. I would also add almond butter when I made the smoothie. Yeah. So okay. So let's talk about the decision to leave then. So then
Sure.
What was there we talked about a crystallizing moment. Was there a crystallizing moment for that for you?
To leave thirst.
Yes.
Yeah. So it was kind of phased. So in 2017, my son was born, and I initially had this plan that literally everybody told me wouldn't work, but I thought would work. I would be his full-time caretaker, while my husband was at a more traditional job, but no nanny or support. And then also keep Thirst running because we had managers. We had 2 stores at the time, managers in each location. And I thought this was a great plan. And of course, it was a terrible plan. I was exhausted. I felt like I was doing a terrible job as a business owner and a terrible job as a mother. And it didn't work. So that was the first thing that happened. And, my husband and I talked about it and decided that in around like December of 2017, so our son was 3 months, that I would try and find a job around when he turned 1 year old, because then we would be able to, Thirst was not kicking off enough money to pay for childcare, but I would be able to dedicate some time to that job, a little bit of time to Thirst. Our son would be well taken care of. I was quickly realizing that in addition to my plan being a bad one, I was just not meant to stay at home full time. And so we had this whole plan, and I ended up just getting really lucky. And rather than when he was 1 finding a job, I started kind of like poking around on what was available and found something like 2 weeks after we decided that I would go back to work. So in January of 2018, I started as an in-house lawyer at the Boston Globe. So I was doing that in addition to, being a mom, but with help. And also we were still running Thirst. It got to be a lot. It was actually much better than trying to be, full-time stay-at-home mom and full-time stay-at-home business owner, but it was a lot. And Thirst was profitable, but also in this scary position where like a few bad months could have put us in the red. And so first we closed our Wellesley location because of kind of disagreements with our landlord. We'll just leave it at that. And then at the end of our Boston lease, which was in November of 2019, we decided not to renew. And it was largely just because, I had a full-time other job. My husband had a full-time other job, and Thirst, as much as we had loved it, was causing a lot of stress. And it turned out to be a very, very just pure lucky decision because, as you know, March 2020, Boston shuts down for the next, 18 months took them, I think, 3 years to get a new tenant into that space. But, it was kind of a gradual decision and evolution. There was really no light bulb moment with shutting down Thirst.
And so in making a decision, like, you ran into, challenging issues with management, with operations, with, counterparties like a landlord. Are there any principles from any of these that you, let's share what this category of kinds of issues that businesses run into, or let's say forms of conflict, if you want to think in terms of like a litigator, are there any enduring principles they use today, maybe just beyond work or at work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of kind of lesson learned, some of which could probably be put into principles. One is you have to be really clear on your why of why you're doing something. And for Thirst, it was this combination of passion project, and it was supposed to be our job. And I think we should have raised prices a lot earlier than we did, and probably should have paid our employees less than we did. Although I would never have wanted to do that. But, had we done that, we would have looked a lot like other similar companies in the area, and we probably would have been more profitable, maybe to the point where it would have been worth the risk to keep Thirst open. I don't know. That's kind of one thing. I think in terms of the conflict, planning for conflict, which is something we do as litigators anyway. I mean, it's almost funny to me, some of the situations that we ended up getting into with Thirst, because I know better. But, planning for the worst case scenario from day one. So, assume that everything that could go wrong will when you're negotiating any agreement, is also key. But a lot of it is just, it's not so much, a principle or something went wrong. It's just like the time came and went, and now it's over. At least is how I look at it.
Do you have a point of view on lawyers having side businesses?
I think it's great. I mean, I think it's important to understand why you're having the side businesses. But I think being a multidimensional human rather than just a lawyer is really valuable, both to people's happiness and even to their effectiveness as a lawyer, because it's a lot easier to make kind of principled, logical decisions when your whole identity isn't wrapped up in being a lawyer. A question that I always have when someone tells me about a side business is, why? Do you do it for fun? Do you do it for money? Do you do it because you are planning an eventual exit? And then I think most concerningly, really the only one that's concerning, do you do it because you're unhappy and you're just trying to fill up all of your time so that you don't have time to sit with your thoughts? Which, that one's concerning. The others, it's sort of like you do you, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. And then how did a former litigator who ran a juice bar end up as an in-house lawyer at a media company?
Randomly, as it feels like my whole career has gone. So, as I mentioned, December 2017, started kind of looking around what was available for Boston legal jobs. I had never practiced in Boston. I had only practiced in New York. So I really had no sense of even, what the market looked like. Things were just different. I knew I didn't want to go back to a firm. And, I'd been at actually like a political event, and a friend of a friend had joked, "Oh, you should come work for me." He's a GC of a local company. And we talked about it, and he ended up not having anything that was a good fit, but it got me kind of on the idea of exploring what it might mean to be in-house, which was really not something I'd ever given that much thought to. Like, even when I'd initially left S&C and thought about other options, I hadn't really explored what it meant to be an in-house lawyer. And so I saw this job at the Boston Globe that seemed cool. I mean, having grown up in Boston, the Boston Globe is a big deal. It's our local paper. It covers all our local sports. We care about it. And the job was actually not that interesting itself. It was like reviewing and negotiating all of their basic contracts. So everything from like the ink that they use to print their newspapers to, more substantive licensing agreements and that type of thing. And so I was mostly attracted by the brand and also the general counsel, who I knew a bit previously. And so I saw the job on Indeed, I think. Was that what it was then? And reached out, and I actually had a connection to him. He had worked with my mom. And so I said, will he talk to me? And she's like, I don't know. Sure. Let me see. So he agreed to talk to me. And his initial reaction was, I don't think you want to do this job. I was like, well, what do you mean? Like, well, I just need somebody to review and negotiate contracts. You're used to this like fairly complex securities litigation. You've been doing all this interesting stuff, standing up your own business. I don't know if this is for you. And I was like, I want to do it. I will do it well. I can do it. I've been negotiating contracts for bananas. If I can negotiate a contract for a banana, I think I can negotiate contract for ink for your paper. And convinced him to hire me for, significantly less than what you would pay to a first year associate, more like paralegal. But it was great. And I only did the contract work exclusively for about a month. I just kept raising my hand after that. And so the job that I actually did at the Globe, which was fantastic, and I loved and actually never really planned to leave, was nothing like the job that had been described when I first applied.
And what did that job evolve into?
So when I left, I was VP and Deputy General Counsel. The General Counsel was by that point also in like a co-business role where he was developing their new media arm. And so I was doing basically everything and anything that he didn't have time for. So that was everything from like public records requests to overseeing someone else who was doing the regular, contract negotiations, to employment work, to licensing. It was very broad and very interesting because the Globe was at such an interesting time in its history where the local paper in so many ways is dying, but the Globe is not. And it's finding ways to make sure it doesn't. And so being part of the team that was trying to do that was just really exciting.
And how did you, these are brand new practice areas. Like, how did you pick up these new skills and the confidence to say, okay, yes, I can take that on?
I think a lot of it came from thirst. I had no business starting a juice bar. I had a lemonade stand when I was, 5, and somehow that translates into an actual juice bar. So a lot of it was once you've figured out that you know how to figure out random things, it becomes a lot easier. And then I also had some really good support and mentorship at the Globe, both from Dan, the GC, and they had some really fantastic outside counsel, guy named John Albano, who basically knows public records work in Massachusetts as well as anyone, and who kind of taught me enough that I could take that over, which was a really specialized, but also super interesting field of work that I did a lot of and got into there, where it was basically, supporting the reporters in their efforts to get the public records from various government entities in the states, like state FOIA.
Yes.
To which they're legally entitled, but which often the government puts up a fight, and that's typical. And so you have to make all the arguments, and there's all these, exemptions to deal with. There's super interesting. And John really helped me with that. And then, at a certain point you learn, I've learned juice bars, I've learned public records, I've learned licensing and IP. And at a certain point, it's like, okay, there are many things that I don't know, but I know how I can learn things. And that made it a lot easier over time.
Do you feel like is there a playbook you can share from how you learn new things?
If you have an expert to learn from, that is, I think, one of the best first or second steps. Take an hour with them and ask them how to learn that particular area. And that is what I did with John, who gave me a bunch of briefs that had been filed with the court and said, go read these, plus go read all the cases they cite. And you'll pretty much be able to figure things out. That was specific to public records, right? But an expert in a different area can give you the playbook for that. Maybe it's reading aspects of the Delaware Code, whatever the thing is. And then the other way that I learn is just from reading widely. not everybody learns that way, but I do really well. I loved school. I loved like textbooks. And so I love things like I have practical law now. I think it is so valuable. Firm blog posts, you have to get this initial, very basic level as soon as possible, as soon as you know that you need to know something. And then it's just a question of starting to do. I think doing early is important as well, although you obviously need to know something before you can do. But yeah, I think those are the biggest things. It does vary a little bit from area to area.
Mm-hmm. And then, you mentioned that you're, well, I guess we can talk about the influence that your parents had shortly, but I guess you then started to build this name for yourself for, as someone who can pick up new areas within the globe. How did you transition to be I feel like I saw you on LinkedIn as someone who started to talk about the transitions you made. That's how I got to know you initially and learn some of these parts of your story. How did you come to start sharing your story on LinkedIn?
Yeah. So I realized pretty early on at the Globe that I love being in-house. I would probably be in-house for the rest of my legal career. And that, that was where I wanted to be. And I also realized that I love the Globe, didn't really want to leave, but would probably never be its general counsel because Dan is only 4 years older than I am. And he also loves the Globe and will probably never leave it, which is great. I mean, having a team that is that loyal is amazing for a company. So, but I had a problem because nobody in Boston, knew who I was, or if I did, they knew me as like the juice bar lady, not a lawyer, the way people in New York had. So I initially started posting on LinkedIn along with going to local bar association events just to start to build a local network. This was pre-COVID, so people like got jobs locally too. And, went into offices and all those things. So I initially started just because I wanted people to know who I was and I wanted to know who they were in the legal world in Boston.
And then how did it kind of evolve over time? Because now I think you're very prolific and known for big picture ideas. Like what was the journey along the way to that?
Yeah. So I started just to meet people locally, and it turned out that I was connecting with people, kind of all over the country and really enjoying it. And that the posts that seemed to resonate the most and that I enjoyed the discussion around the most were really around the bigger picture thoughts. How do I think about being an in-house lawyer? How do I think about transition? What's the right role of failure and success? Rather than like, what does this aspect of the public record law mean? Or how should we interpret this piece of copyright? So it was fortunate because people liked the same things that I liked talking about. And so it kind of just went from there. I have experimented over the years with posting more often, less often, commenting more, less, but I'm kind of now at this cadence of once a week, which I find, isn't enough that I think I'm still on people's radars, still getting the chance to have great discussions, try and get on there and comment on other people's posts and, meet new people more than once a week. But also I'm not giving a ton of my time or energy to LinkedIn. I'm using it as a tool to meet people and learn from people, but it's not really about LinkedIn. It's just kind of a way to learn and grow my community.
Do you have tips for other people who want to become more active on LinkedIn and do what you just described?
Yeah. I mean, I think for most people, just starting to talk about their personal stories is a really easy, surprisingly effective way to start to build a community on LinkedIn. I think for most of us, our stories feel like they wouldn't be that interesting because we lived them. But if you actually start talking about it, you'll find that people are fascinated by them because of the similarities or the differences or whatever it is. So sharing about your personal experience, I think, is great. Sharing about how you think about things, I think also is really interesting because it starts interesting conversations and allows you to build real relationships over time with the people who you're engaging with. It's obviously different for in-house lawyers who are probably just looking to kind of meet people and grow communities than law firm lawyers who may be looking for clients. But for in-house, just having these discussions and meeting people, is fun, makes the practice feel more rewarding, and can have kind of unexpected benefits, that you may or may not be looking for. So it's worth just starting to talk. I had said I was never planning to, not never, but I wasn't planning to leave the globe anytime soon. And I ended up getting my current job largely because of LinkedIn. A woman who had helped me redo my resume for just like a side writing professor job I was doing, who I liked, and we talked from time to time, but not often, knew my boss who was hiring at Red Cell. And when he reached out to her and said, I need an in-house lawyer who has also been in big law, ideally, and run a business. She's like, oh, Heather's been talking about this on LinkedIn. Let me connect you. And it turned out to be like a really great fit that she certainly wouldn't have been likely to think of me had I not stayed top of mind by talking about this so frequently.
Yeah, I love that. And then how did you size up? I mean, you love the globe, great experience. Yes, you recognize that, you are can be GC anytime soon, but how did you evaluate this opportunity to see whether it made sense for you?
Yeah. So when she first reached out, I looked at the website for Red Zone. I was like, nope, definitely not going to do this. At the time, it looked very different than it does now, but it was a bunch of, like men, former government officials with whom I didn't necessarily share political leanings, looked a little, think tankish. But I decided to talk to the guy who would be hiring me, and completely changed my mind once I heard about what they were actually doing. So what Red Cell does is build and invest in, national security and healthcare companies that are using AI and tech. And what was so cool about it to me was that I did love Thirst and I did love building a business. It just hadn't quite worked out. But this was an opportunity to help build a bunch of businesses as a lawyer. So that was one thing that was really big. The other was that as much as I love the globe, it could feel slow moving at times. There were places where we were racing ahead, trying to, innovate, and that was great. But also it's a, 250-year-old or whatever it is, paper that has some entrenched processes, can be a little slow. And I knew that going to Red Cell would be different than that. And then I did want to be a GC eventually. I hadn't really planned on it as early as it ended up happening, but it just felt like kind of an opportunity I'd been looking forward to coming early. And so I decided to go for it. Telling Dan, my boss at the Globe, really was not fun. I felt terrible, but he of course was excited for me. But yeah, in the end, and once I understood the opportunity, it was an easy decision, largely just because of the ability to participate in building businesses while also being a lawyer. Combine the two things I wanted to be doing.
What did being a GC mean to you? Like, what was significant or important about that for you?
Yeah. So as not the GC, you're obviously doing legal work with hopefully, the business in mind, but you're not always in the room for some of the big picture business strategy decisions. As a GC, you are, or at least hopefully you are. And I think that's just really fun, and it makes the role more rewarding. And it also takes out some of the frustration when, you get to be there and share your view up front, and you can at least sometimes avoid the business doing something that creates legal work that didn't make sense or legal challenges later, or at least people know about it. When they're doing something that's going to create regulatory challenges or compliance issues or whatever, at least it's being planned for because you were in the room, and it's also like in your head, so you're emotionally prepared for it. I also like managing and like mentoring people, and my team right now is very small. But I like that aspect of being a GC, of getting to kind of like grow a team with me.
I want to double back to the Globe. What was the biggest challenge for you when you moved into the GGC role and had taken on? Like, at some point you learned how to learn all these new areas, but what was the biggest challenge you had to overcome in that transition?
Within the globe from like, it's a good question. When the title actually changed, it didn't feel like anything because the role had kind of been evolving and the title followed. But it was a challenge to figure out how to be strategic in a way that made sense. So I think I've talked to you more before about how I, tried to get involved in business meetings and understand what people were trying to do and all of that early on. And that's important, I think, in any role, regardless of your seniority level or role as an in-house lawyer. But as you move into more senior roles, you have to do that, but also in a way that is more strategic in terms of understanding the weight of what you're saying. So like if legal says, oh, that's a good idea or that's a bad idea, it can be taken very seriously in ways you might not want it to, almost like the CEO has to be careful about what they say. If you are a senior lawyer talking to a junior developer, you might just be brainstorming. But you have to be cautious about doing that. And then also, as I moved into the DGC role, I was, managing a team and helping to allocate their resources and time and make sure we were kind of focusing our priorities in ways that aligned with what the Globe was trying to do. And that required coordination, obviously with Dan, our actual GC, and with the, broader team.
And then similarly, what was the biggest transition or challenge in taking on the GC role at this fund?
Mm-hmm. I'm more than 2 years in and I still feel like I'm drinking from the fire hose. And I think that's kind of the nature of the business we're in. We keep doing more and more, but the challenge was and continues to be appropriate prioritization. There is a lot of work that needs to get done, but we all have to be careful as like a whole legal team and even broader Red Cell team about making sure that we're also pausing to think about making sure that as we race ahead, we're racing in the right direction. So I think that's one of the biggest things. And then there was also a steep learning curve at the beginning for just learning about corporate governance in Delaware C Corps and, issuing equity and all these things that I hadn't really done. I'd seen the backside of it when I was at Sullivan and Cromwell dealing with shareholder derivative suits and securities litigation. But there were new areas of substantive law that I had to learn while also figuring out how to be a GC.
And then how do you allocate your attention between, you mentioned that there's this intersection of legal issues and business issues that you get to dive into. How do you allocate your attention between those two?
I don't necessarily think of it as separate most of the time. I mean, there are times when I'm just sitting there literally, like I was saying before, like reading practical law or reading a new opinion that may change how we interpret something or learning about Corporate Transparency Act. But for most of the time, when it's thinking, it's how do these pieces fit together? So it really, if we want to be able to use this IP in these three companies, but also be able to sell that company ahead of this company, how do we need to structure that? Right. And that is legal and business. And you can't really, you can't separate one from the other.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the Globe is like this very old institution, and Red Cell is considerably newer. And by nature of the business, they probably have very different risk profiles. Like, how did you get comfortable with, how to advise on risk, comparing to the Globe to today?
Yeah. It is very different, right? So at the Globe, we kind of had set amounts of risk we were willing to take on certain things, but we also weren't doing that many things that were all that risky, at least that I was involved in. I would say some of the new media work that my boss was doing probably did involve more risk just because it was newer and the law was less developed. Yeah, I mean, we are constantly talking about how to manage and balance risk at Red Cell and our portfolio companies. And there are some places where we will, draw a clear line. We will not violate the law. which sounds like, yeah, obviously, Heather. But for example, we have this company that is now a platform for obtaining psychedelic assisted therapy. Only psychedelic assisted therapy that is legal in the United States, meaning federally and state. So right now that's just ketamine. But figuring out, like in the beginning, well, what if we started an Ibogaine facility in Mexico? It's legal there. That type of thing was a real challenge. And we just have to weigh business upside versus legal risk. So ultimately, some of those things we decided didn't make sense because it was hard to, even with that example, even though it's legal to do that in Mexico, building that into our overall business strategy, repatriating that money was going to be very challenging. Wasn't really like who we wanted to be as a company. We want to be fully on the side of the law. But then when there's things like grayer areas, we just have to have discussions about it. There are certain places where courts haven't opined, where the law isn't fully developed. Like everything around AI is new. And it's just important on aligning everyone, including our insurers in some case, around what we're doing.
You mentioned the Globe. It was an institution that you bind, so you grew up loving. And so there's that you had a certain love of business and consumed the business work product that way. Let's say with psychedelics, do you feel like it would be beneficial for you to consume a legal psychedelic to really understand the business?
That's a great question. So what we're doing, or what Tara is doing, is ketamine assisted therapy for treatment resistant depression and PTSD, because I don't have either of those things. No. If I did, I would absolutely give it a try. And I know lots of people who do, and it's changed their lives.
Mm-hmm. So at this stage in your career, like what is the thing that you're most excited about in say a year time horizon?
So, I'm a little over 2 years in, and Red Cell is totally different than it was 1 year ago and 2 years ago. And I think we're going to be something really different and really cool, in another year. I am excited for how we are not just building companies that make a difference, which is so important, but from a legal perspective, we're starting to really think strategically about how the different companies can interact with and be set up in ways that benefit each other, so that even if they are independent companies, we're creating this more powerful whole than the sum of the parts. And we haven't quite figured everything out yet, but we're going in that direction. And I'm really excited to take it there and to see where we go.
Mm-hmm. I guess at this point, do you feel like nothing about your career can surprise you at this point? There's no career decision you can make, given how disparate the different paths have been. Nothing you could do would surprise you in the coming years.
The only thing that would surprise me would be going back to a law firm. Sure. Nothing could surprise me. And I think that's cool. I mean, I feel like I could not literally do anything, but I kind of feel the flexibility to do whatever I want. Having left the law, having left like a prestigious big law job for Thirst, which is admittedly, not prestigious, very risky, very like hands-on dirty, like covered in fruit juice all day. If you can do that, like what can't you do? And so it's a really cool place to be.
Can you talk about that? Because we talked about the finances of making the decision, but talk about the status issue, because that's so huge, right? I mean, like you just Sullivan Cromwell litigation, New York, in Manhattan, beautiful office. You've got your own office, all these trappings of success. And you went to Columbia, so many of your peers are probably almost all of your peers are in counsel institutions, and that's your entire reference group. How did you get over that status hit to watch this like no-name juice bar in Boston?
Yeah. So I'll tell you, when I was first making the decision to do Thirst, I didn't really think about it, and I couldn't tell you why. Like the status thing just didn't occur to me. I started to feel it as former colleagues would come in to say hi and support us, and we're completely there and being kind and in no way judgmental, but they'd be there in their like suits, and I'm there in my baseball cap and oversized t-shirt. Or we would do catering orders to some of the Boston firms. And I'm literally going in through the service entrance with like my cart of juice. And that was briefly hard, but also I was doing what I wanted to be doing. And I knew that. And I was kind of too busy for the first year to worry about that or to think really about much of anything other than getting through the day. I mean, I was exhausted. It wasn't like a healthy place to be long term, but it's kind of the nature of starting a business. It was it was fine. It's just not where you want to be for years and years. So that by the time like things started to calm down, and I wasn't always the one like running across Boston with a cart full of juice, I was over it, right? It was like, okay, I've done that. I have delivered to these people. I have worn my baseball cap around my, colleagues in their fancy suits, and it's okay. So I don't have a really good answer other than like, you just do it. And at some point you realize it doesn't matter.
Yeah. I think what's interesting is I think that would be such a different story post pandemic where people's values change in every aspect of that story. Who's walking around in a suit that way? So just like everything about that story would be completely different post. So I really admire your story during that, pre-pandemic. But I feel like if you were going through that experience 3 years later or whatever, very different experience.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I think there are a lot of people who whose values align more with doing something like Thirst after we experienced the pandemic. And I also think, and I can't like put a weight on how much this matters, but I never started with a chip on my shoulder or anything to prove when I went into law. Like from a very young age, everyone always told me, and society told me, and my parents told me, like, you'll be whoever you want to be. You'll do whatever you want to do. And so nobody was like surprised when I got into Columbia or went to S&C or any of those things, just because of like the opportunities that I had growing up. And I think that made it easier for me in some ways to do something different, both because it's not that I hadn't worked as hard to get there, but I'd always expected to get there.
Yes.
And because I always felt like I could go back.
Yep. That's huge. And that's a part of the story that I alluded to earlier that I'd like to pick up, because you mentioned your mom's a lawyer. Your father's also as well. Can you talk some more about those influences? Because that easily could have cut in both directions, right? I mean, it could have cut in the direction of like, oh, this pressure, like my parents, they've had entire careers out of this. Why am I different? You could have felt all this pressure. Tell me, what was it something about how they parented? Is it something that you observed along the way? What was it about that influence that had the outcome that you just described?
Yeah, gosh, so many things. So, my parents are both lawyers, as you said. My mom was a litigator. Is a litigator. I won't tell you how old because she'd be mad, but she's old enough to be my mom and she's still practicing. And she like loved work and loved trial work. And I watched that and we were very similar. And growing up, I thought, I think I want to do that too. That seems really cool. And, they never pressured me to be a lawyer. They always said, like, you go do what you want to do. If you want to do this, that's great. You want to do something else, that's great too. I did Teach for America after law school. At one point, I thought I'd do something related to urban studies, which was my undergrad major. They're fine with whatever. And then I got to S&C and I was a litigator, and I was a litigator, but what I was doing was so completely different than, what my mom was doing as a trial lawyer in Boston, where like the relatively big cases actually go to trial, whereas these multi-billion-dollar securities litigations don't typically go to trial. And, you would think with access to lawyers in my family and my social networks, I would have realized this difference before I got there, but I didn't. So that was a funny surprise. So that's one thing. When I told my parents that I was going to leave Sullivan and Cromwell to start a juice bar, I think a lot of parents would not be pleased with that decision. My parents paid for all of my education. They paid for my undergrad and my law school. And they were just like, really? Are you sure? And I said, yep, I'm really sure. And they're like, okay, how can we help? And my dad, who was retired by this time, walked over and bought a smoothie almost every day And it was great because I got to see him, and he'd come in even when I wasn't there. And our manager would like text me pictures of him being like, your dad was in. And my mom would cater smoothies for her practice group lunches. And, I'm lucky that way, but they've just always been super supportive. And I think that made a lot of these decisions easier. And also, I was talking before about the value of not having your whole identity wrapped up in your legal career. And I think the fact that they never told me it should matter really helped too. I think a lot of people grow up hearing like, you're going to be a doctor when you grow up, or you're going to be a lawyer, or whatever the thing is. And they get there or they don't, but that's it's almost ingrained in them by that point that that's some key part of who they are, or the key part. And I never felt that way about my career. It's one thing that I'm doing, whether it's a lawyer or not. It is something, it is important, it is valuable. It is not the only thing.
You probably observed a lot of things about lawyers growing up that maybe now, as an experienced lawyer, you can reinterpret those experiences. What are some interesting like reinterpretations of observations you made? And I recognize that, maybe certain aspects of practice have changed over time, or dynamics among lawyers have changed over time. But is there anything interesting there that you like look back now, like, oh, I saw it this way back then, which was interesting itself, and actually I re-experience it differently now that I experienced law?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Something that is kind of the same, but looks so different now versus watching like my parents and their friends growing up, is how tight the legal community can be. And so I remember growing up and like seeing them have dinner parties with lawyer friends and judges, and like, that was always a weird thing to me, and is still a weird thing to me that lawyers and judges are allowed to be friends, although we know that the ethical ones have all sorts of disclosure obligations to accuse themselves and stuff like that. But looking at that then, I thought it was so weird. All these friendships. I thought that it was like a forced thing that lawyers had to hang out outside of work. And that's like the perspective of a child, basically. But I now see that there is this huge value in having relationships with your professional community, and that I think lawyers are actually really good at that. And post-COVID, some of that has moved online. And I actually think that's some of what I've gotten from LinkedIn, is all these relationships with other lawyers who I may or may not see regularly. I have some friends now who are like lawyer friends who I bounce ideas off of, who I've literally never met in person. And that is kind of both a similarity and a difference. And then just like an interesting thing that I have observed that I think is a shift is that I do think lawyers used to wrap up more of their identity in who they like in being lawyers, and lawyers would often, go to one firm and stay there for their whole career. And that was typical. And that's just not what it means to be a lawyer anymore. There are some, but there are so many more options. And so watching the evolution of the profession has been interesting.
I think there's an interesting connection to make between two things that you've really underscored, which is the value of connections with other lawyers, with separating lawyer from identity. Isn't that such an interesting combination of things to both believe in? How do you connect those two concepts?
Yeah, totally. Well, just like I don't think you should have one set of friends, right? Like I think that we all have these different interests and strengths and weaknesses and needs. And one of those things that is a need and can become a strength is having a community of like-minded people. And if you are currently a lawyer, a good place to find at least some of that is with other lawyers. But also, if that's all you have, if you lose the career or if you change your mind, then you're going to be in a really tough place. So I don't think that it's contradictory. It's just different aspects of kind of like who we are and what we need.
And then, you've talked about this concept of lawyers should, it's good for lawyers to not have their entire identity wrapped up into their work. What happens when they do?
I had a LinkedIn post about this the other day, and some of the reactions were really fascinating to me. I think when they do, they're in big trouble. A couple people said, and they didn't say it of themselves, so I would like to talk to these people, but a couple people said, I have friends who live, breathe, love lawyering, and it's all they have. And if they lose one job, they'll find another. If they lose one case, they're down, but they're back up. And it's what makes them happy. That is interesting. Maybe it exists. I think more typically, it makes you unhappy and makes it harder to make good decisions. Because if you think that fundamentally who you are is just a lawyer, and then you take a hit, you lose a case, you lose a client, it's really hard to deal with. If you get to a point where maybe the position you're in no longer makes sense, it's harder to let go and say, maybe I should take a break from this role, take a break from lawyering. So I think it's a really risky position to be in. And I feel that way about just being almost anything. It's not just lawyers. Like I would be similarly concerned about somebody just being a doctor.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel like have prescriptions for people for how to, not have all their identity and sense of self-worth or attention or how any of those categories of things in being a lawyer? Like is there a playbook or rules down that people can use for, diversity in their identity, or how else do you frame that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's at least two pieces. One is like the mental, how you think about yourself. And the other is what you actually do with yourself and your time. And they're related, but not identical. So on the how you spend your time piece, because I think that helps with the mental, like go do other things. If you don't have any hobbies anymore, well, what did you like to do when you were 10? I'm not the first person to say that, but literally like spend half an hour a week drawing or riding a bike or whatever, just doing something that brings you joy or you find interesting or that you're bad at, but could be fun. Just to be something other than just a lawyer. And then the mental piece, I think so much of it is just how you talk to yourself about yourself. So, if you tell yourself you're just a lawyer, that's how it's going to feel. But like, are you also a partner, a parent, a friend? Are you a member of certain communities in, like, I don't know, church groups, political groups, civic groups, whatever it is, teams? And, identifying those things and just telling yourself, oh yes, I am, I'm a lawyer and a mom. And for me, like I'm a lawyer and a mom and a wife and a friend and a runner and someone who likes to travel and someone who likes to cook and all these things that go beyond just my professional identity, I think makes it a lot easier when any one thing, whether it's career or some other thing, isn't going right.
You mentioned, I guess essentially you mentioned, trying things that you're not good at, which reminded me of I guess a core question I think about it for myself and others is, how do you think about your strengths as a lawyer? Like, or excuse me, not as a lawyer, just professionally, generally. Like, when you think about your core competency, how do you think about that?
Like, what are they, or how to identify them, or
like what would you say are your core competencies as a professional that say, hey, this is what is attributable, my course of luck, all that kind of stuff, privilege, and that stuff. The things that you have done that have generated success. What do you say? What do you think are the one or two or three things?
Got it. I think a combination of approaching everything with a sense of curiosity and also willingness to work extremely hard, putting those two together, is a key strength. I think one without the other doesn't get you all that far. Because if you're curious, but you don't do anything about it, you're not really any better off. And if you're just grinding, you'll probably be an okay, like junior to mid-level person, but you'll never really progress because you always need someone to tell you exactly what to do. And then I think of myself as really good at kind of reading and reacting to and dealing with people. And I think that's important because so much of how we make huge strides as an organization, any organization, is as a team. And so by being able to kind of like be a good team player, but also reactive to others can really add a lot of value there. And then I said this before, but just like willingness and ability to learn new things, I think is key.
And you kind of broke down the last one and your play there. Can you share anecdotes for the first two? Like what are moments that kind of illustrate those competencies of yours?
Yeah. So in terms of the combination of curiosity and willingness to work hard, I think an example without going into too much detail, was a recent, not that recent, but like a year and a half ago structuring question where we had, like a plan for how we did things, how we set up companies, have all the early stage stuff. And someone mentioned to me the way that a different company, a different incubator was doing it. And so I said, oh, that's interesting. Read something, saw something similar to what they were doing, and kind of started going, got curious, started learning about the different options, going down this rabbit hole. And then two, found a few good options like that seemed to me could be worth exploring more, and actually put in the time to understand what they were, lay it out in a way for my colleagues that was understandable. So they didn't have to like redo all the work I had done of learning about them, pros, cons, comparison. And we ended up changing something about how we structure things in a way that should, make our investors a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
That's an example. On the second one, in terms of people, it's often, how meetings can like be going really well and then suddenly they just like get off track and you're not quite sure what happened, but like everybody's angry and frustrated. A lot of times on the second one, it's just being the person to literally say like, okay, I think that we're all feeling frustrated. Here's what I'm hearing. Like, who hears something different? And it's not really a special skill now that I think about it and describe it. It's more of like a habit of being the person to be like, hey guys, let's pause. This is okay. We're together. How can we move on? And I think anyone can learn to do that. It can feel scary at first to be the one to kind of take control of any room, because you have to be able to do it like in various situations. Including sometimes like where there's power dynamics, like I'll do that even if I'm not the most senior person in the room. But just getting meetings back on track regularly is a good example of how being able to kind of like work well together can help you turn, what was going to be a lost hour back into a productive one.
That's really good. And it seems like part of I think it connects to the curiosity. I think it connects to the indifference to status. It is like what you just described about being indifferent to seniority, who's in control, whatever. Recognizing those as not relevant to connecting people and being a leader in that way. So that's an interesting theme as well in your professional approach.
Yeah, and I actually think being the one to help, in that specific example we were just talking about, getting things back on track, is a great place where sometimes more junior people really can add value. Maybe they're not going to stop a whole meeting and say, hey guys, everybody's frustrated. But when it comes their turn to speak, just be the one to say, I'm feeling like there is some confusion. Can I say back to you what I think I've heard so people can help correct me? And it's not really that they necessarily need to hear back what's been said. They're giving everybody the opportunity to kind of reframe, hear where things have been said out of frustration versus what's really meant, and get back on track.
That's really good. I like that. Well, this topic of strengths is also making me curious about, how do you feel about in your career or prescriptive for other people, do you feel that people should have focus on their strengths, or to what extent should people shore up weaknesses? Like how do you think about that?
It's such a good one. I think ideally you should get into a role that allows you to use your strengths, not just because you're going to be better at it, but because things are more enjoyable when you're good at them. So you're going to enjoy your core role. But then I think, again, depending on the role, there's a lot of value of going from bad to okay at the things that are weaknesses. And again, it depends on your role. But I think if you can get into a place where you are, this is for in-house lawyers, really. I think it's different if you're in a firm. But so for in-house lawyers, you can get to a place where the role really relies heavily on what you're best at and then increase the things you're bad at. You're much better positioned to be an overall advisor to the business, which is really what you want to be as an in-house lawyer. The reason I think it's different for law firm lawyers is I think there's a certain value to being the absolute best at one random little piece of the tax code where people are going to call you and maybe everybody's only calling you for 1 hour, but like you're adding a ton of value just for that. There aren't very many in-house lawyers who can be that specialized, which is why we need to work on our weaknesses.
Yeah, that's great. I'm also doubling back to something that's you mentioned a little bit ago. You mentioned this post about lawyers' identities and some of the surprising comments to that. Is there a LinkedIn post that you are the most proud of?
So I don't think it's necessarily like the best written post, but I have one that excites me the most, which is this post I first wrote several years ago. I don't normally repost my post, but I repost this one that starts, "There's no such thing as too nice to be a lawyer." And every time I post it, it gets thousands of reactions. It's gotten millions of views over the year. And I love, love, love that so many lawyers are like excited and agree on this idea that there's no such thing as too nice to be a lawyer. I definitely always want to be a kind, respectful person who's like doing everything I can, even when I am fighting with somebody who's not being nice to me, to like be a good person in my work and in my personal life. And that's what the post is about. It's talking about how, you can be nice while also negotiating very hard for your client, and you can agree to extensions and all sorts of things that make your counterparty or opposing counsel's life easier where it doesn't hurt your client. Just because it's a good thing to do and it's easy to say no, but you don't need to. And I love it because I like the idea of like a warmer, kinder legal profession where we are respectful of each other, even when we are in tough negotiations. But I also like it because I think a lot of the reactions are about how like anyone can be a lawyer. There's no set type of person that has to be a lawyer, which is, I think, really different than an idea that a lot of people grew up with of a particular like stiff man in a suit as what has to be a lawyer. So yeah, that's probably my favorite of my posts.
Is there a post that you're surprised by in terms of how popular it is?
What was it? I posted one the other day that I was surprised people like so much, but now I can't think of what it is. I can't think of one, but I'll tell you, LinkedIn feels so random to me. A lot of the times it is so hard to tell what resonates, but I'll run experiments. So I don't repost the exact post, but if something seems weird and gets a lot of traction on a particular theme, sometimes like a couple months later, I'll try again with that theme and it works again. And it's so, I don't get it, but, yeah. Oh, I remember the recent one. It was about, lawyers are service providers. And when we say like, let me know if you have any questions, we have to mean it. And it was just funny how many people reacted to it. And I had posted something similar before and been surprised. And so this was a bit of an experiment, but yeah, I don't know. I love starting conversations.
Because you mentioned like you're not saying you want to like cross your fingers that no one's going to follow up on that. That's it's totally a fantastic thing that no one talks about. But yeah, that's what we'd be able to say. Let me know if you have any questions. Like, please don't bother me.
Yeah, and people had all the thoughts, and of course, a bunch of law firm lawyers jumped in, being like, "Of course, I'm open to questions. This is not for you because most of you are billing hourly for those questions. This is about everybody else."
Yeah, totally. Well, I'm really glad we took the time to sit down because I think just your worldview is so fascinating. I think you're such a warm and open person. So, I'm glad that I found you on LinkedIn. I think you are one of my favorite people to follow on there. And I just think that you have such a fresh perspective, and I think you really are a vanguard for how people approach their careers, not just in the decisions you make, but even how to present it and share it with people. So I really appreciate you in that way.
Oh, thank you. I love your posts. Love talking to you. Love this podcast. So thanks for having me on.
Center.